Professor Molefe is here now. Professor Molefe, are you there?
I've been here listening to very interesting conversations
Oh, thank you so much.
about
iPhone, I didn't
things.
see the name. I was looking out for the name. Good to
No, no,
know
no, I've been
you.
here. I was here even when my absence was declared. When I'm present, I was here. I thought it's an interesting metaphysical phenomena happening right there. But I thought,
All right,
let me not
awesome, awesome.
disturb.
All
Yes,
right, thank you. It's good to have you here. So, all right, people, our next lecture, entitled Personhood in African Metaphysics. Uh, is going to be delivered by Professor Motsamai Molefe. Professor Motsamai Molefe is a professor of philosophy at University of South Africa Graduate School of Business Leadership, and he's going to be taking us on I think that's the final lecture for today. All right, Professor Molefe, the floor is yours now. Thank you so much.
thank you. Let me begin by just making a minor correction.
Oh,
It
okay.
does not have significant metaphysical consequences. Officially, I'm a professor of ethics, leadership, and governance. I have
Oh, oh,
uh,
okay, okay.
I
All
have
right.
since abandoned my home in philosophy.
All right.
Uh,
My bad. All
yeah,
right. Thank you for the
but
correction.
I am a resident in this community of philosophers.
All right.
Yes, yeah. Hello,
Okay.
thanks a lot for to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to yourself for welcoming me in this platform, and also the conversations that are happening, and also Conversational School of Philosophy, um, and the leadership of Prof. Chimokanam in driving this particular agenda, and the collaborations also from other colleagues in the Conversational School of Philosophy. This has become a vibrant, powerful, and a unique voice that is giving Africa a particular color, a color that has not been there before. Africa has always been um, a replica of the West, wearing African clothes. But I think something distinctive is happening here, and it's good to watch it, and also time and again to come and participate. Congratulations, colleagues, for this, and also I'm very humbled to be invited here. I'm not sure I've got a lot to say, but maybe let me start. Maybe let me start here. Let me start with my ruminations about this idea of metaphysics. Um, those who are familiar with my work, I'm not very big on metaphysics. I've really struggled. It's a difficult subject, and I found it to be such a strange thing, even from my undergraduate studies. Uh,
Uh,
so, I mean,
excuse
the
me,
first
please.
meaning,
Excuse me, Prof. Please, your slides. Do you have slides to share?
no, I don't have slides.
Uh,
It's
uh,
just me. Yeah.
okay. May we please see your face, if that's convenient?
Yes, you definitely can see my face. Um, I'm. That's why I didn't want to show you. I'm sitting outside my house
Uh,
because my internet is bad in the house. But
okay.
let's
Thank you.
talk.
All right.
I've never
Thank you.
been afraid to show myself as an African child. Yes. Um, so the real encounter I have with metaphysics is in the book A Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. A very abstruse, difficult text to read. What made it worse was that I'm an English second language speaker, trained in a not so perfect education system in Soweto. So my English is substandard, and also the text itself. As I'm listening to the lecturer keeps complaining about the inadequacy of English to a person who himself has inadequate English. And they keep going back to German. Say German gives the richness of the text. Now, I can't access German. At the same time, I've got little access to English. So that's my encounter with the critique of pure reason. But so if you read the prefaces of this book, um, a profound idea that comes there is the idea that really strikes at the core, where Kant talks of metaphysics as the queen of the sciences. You know, metaphysics as the queen of the sciences. Um, and the profound idea here that begins grappling in my mind is, what is reality? What is an approach to reality that is posited by this particular book? And the idea that really struck me, it's when he talks about Copernicus, that Copernicus didn't start in the world and then come to a conclusion. He started with a pure idea and then got into the world, So this idea of pure concepts, and that somehow, you prove them a priori, So as if to suggest that you don't need the world to know about reality. Reality, in a sense, is prior to the world. So, and that idea for me was very strange. I mean, that distinction between a priori and a posteriori, right? As if to suggest that the a priori is prior and important. So when we think about reality, really, the proper zone of metaphysics is the a priori, right? And I really struggled with that idea. I really struggled with that idea. I really struggled with that idea. And my struggle with that idea is that I couldn't fit it. I couldn't fit it anywhere in the world that I grew up in reality. But not only that, the training of philosophy itself couldn't fit the whole world that I lived into the curriculum of philosophy. I couldn't talk about Soweto. I couldn't talk about the reality of Soweto as a metaphysical object. Those were just mere occurrences. Those were just their posteriori. And therefore, I didn't find myself an expression as a subject of metaphysics, because metaphysics must be in their priori. So I found that particular tension. And that's just the introduction that I want to come into this particular conversation with. Why have we been convinced as African philosophers that the a priori is the proper place from which to engage metaphysics? And what's the place of the a posteriori, the empirical, the mundane, the day-to-day? And for me, that has been something that I found to be very, very interesting. And this idea also had very profound implications for the way I relate with philosophy. Because I started being attracted to sociological thinking. And one of the ideas that I found interesting in sociology, this idea of sociological imagination. The idea of sociological imagination is the idea that for us to understand any phenomenon or a career of any phenomenon, we need to understand the social processes that make it real, right? So if you take the phenomena of the markets, you take the phenomena of money. Money wouldn't make sense until we understand the social processes, the social institutions that make money to make sense, right? And all of our lives, I mean, a career in philosophy would not make sense if there was this history of institutions that valued this particular practice, and there were universities that were supported by government institutions and the right? To understand the emergence and the function of a philosopher, you really have to understand its sociological place. Right? So that idea started making sense to me because more and more when I looked into the curriculum in philosophy, I found it to have the poverty of sociological imagination. Right? It's like, I mean, people can discuss with you a concept in ethics of utilitarianism, and they discuss it as a pure concept that has got no location, that has got no social basis. And the social basis is not a proper philosophical, the historical emergence of this idea is not a proper philosophical of interest because it's their posteriori, right? So I started realizing that a particular issue and started grappling with that to say that philosophy as it is and the way that we are approaching it is not able to talk to the realities of the ordinary. It's not able to talk to the realities of the ordinary. And that for me is not interest. That for me is not surprising. It's because of the assumption and approaches we take towards metaphysics, at least in a large measure. I'm awake to the fact that there are metaphysical issues that seem to reside entirely with what you might call the priori, right? But I'm not sure that tells us the whole story about physics. I'm not sure we were not hasty as African philosophers to buy to this approach by Kant of how to approach metaphysics. Now, with that rough introduction, in my approach, I emphasize that a meaningful philosophical engagement must take seriously the idea of sociological imagination. And I think that to me brings us closer to the reality that are happening in Africa, which is something that really has escaped a lot of work that you find in philosophy. Um, 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 Maybe let me give a last example to make the point of this. I read Menkiti, I read Jeche, I read Wiredu, and they talk about human rights. In all these writings, the problem of black racism does not feature. The problem of the fact that we live in a racist world does not feature. They talk about human rights as if there's no problem of being black in the world. And I suppose is this underlying metaphysical assumption that overlooks sociological imagination. What world do we live in? What are the processes that inform us? What are the institutions that we live in? What is the world that we live in? The entire discourse of personhood that I'm going to talk about briefly when I turn into some of my reflections on personhood. There's no reflection on the fact that we experience our personhood and humanity in urbanization. We still imagine pristine Africa. No one is imagining about the meaning of personhood when you live in a ghetto, in the slums somewhere in Africa. No one is thinking about what it means to think about personhood when you live in a leafy suburbs of northern Johannesburg or Pretoria East, or alternatively somewhere in the villages in Bulawayo. Right. So, but we always, when we discuss this idea, there's this community that we transport that does not exist. So these ideas have got this strange divorce of sociological imagination. So I thought, let me start by painting that picture of my struggle with this a prioristic approach to metaphysics that dominates much of the discussions. Right. Now let's move into personhood. So I approach the concept of a person in my native languages. I speak Sotho and Zulu, and I also speak Xhosa. I also speak Tonga. In the languages that I speak in South Africa, the concept of personhood in Zulu is umuntu, in Xhosa is umtu, in Sotho ke motho, in Tonga is munu. Right? They amount to the same thing. So the concept of personhood that we discuss, the idea of umuntu. And in the literature that I've been interacting with, I find 4 instances of this concept. And when I talk about instances, I'm saying that 4 different ways that, at least in my interpretation, we could understand the concept of a person. And also, I must be quick to say these concepts intersect in some ways. Or in fact, my argument has always been a proper treatment of this concept is to appreciate the ways in which they can intersect. So the first concept of a person is the ordinary use of it in English, where we refer to a human being, a particular metaphysical object that is distinct from others. To talk of a person, it's distinct from a tree, it's distinct from a stone, it's distinct from water. Here are these objects in the world. One of the objects that you're going to find as you do your survey of things in the world, you're going to find persons. And by persons here, you're referring to a particular ontological kind, a human being, a particular kind of a body, a particular makeup, such that all the things with all those properties, they can be grouped under this ontological kind of human beings. Right? So, example I use in my books is that I think also Jeche uses a similar example. If you're hunting and you're about to shoot, unbeknownst to you, it's a human being, it's not an animal. Someone will say, hey, it's a person. In that instance, they're calling your attention to the hey, of a particular ontological kind, distinct from the one that you think you're shooting, which is an animal, but now it's a human being. So there's that first concept of a person. And in this particular sense, this is a metaphysical concept, right? It's a metaphysical concept, right? And then you find another metaphysical concept. It's a concept that it's been discussed extensively in some literature in the Western discourse. Is the idea of personal identity. So when we use the idea of a person, sometimes we might be using the idea of personal identity. This idea of being the same individual over time. So in other words, if I meet Jonathan, I will assume that this is the same Jonathan I spoke to 3 years ago. And when I talk to him as a philosopher, I assume that I know he's got training in philosophy. I assume that he still has memory of that philosophy, and he is still a philosopher. And then, yeah. So that's the idea of personal identity, right? Um, um, so, for example, if somebody is in hospital, for example, and they had, remember, I don't know if you're familiar with what is called the Phineas case, um, where somebody gets so harmed that they lose their personal identity. And now, when I come to see you, somebody could rightly say, hey, he's no longer the same person, right? Still the same human being, but you're not the same person. And the reference to the same person is a reference to a personal identity, that the identity has changed completely. He was a very kind, reverent Christian. Now he is irreverent, he's cursing, his mannerism and his deportment is completely different. He's now given over to drunkenness. You know what I mean? And he's no longer the same person. So the claim there is really an evaluation of their personal identity, personal identity. So there are those two metaphysical concepts. There are two other concepts as well of personhood, which we typically describe them as normative. We typically describe them as normative. So the first one is a typical one that we find in Menkiti's and Menkiti's work, Ikunube's work, and many other scholars. Just the idea when you assign the status of a person, it's a status term. When you assign a status of a person, you are really honoring them. So you can say when you say you are a person, it's really an act of honoring. It's an evaluative act where you honor someone, say that they are living a good life, they've got a good character. You're making a judgment about the quality of their deportment. So there's that concept of a personhood. Um, 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 and then the last concept of a personhood as well is normative in a sense. In the literature in the West, typically we also use the idea of moral status to refer to this one. In this sense, when you say a person, we mean you have moral citizenship. We mean that you're a moral patient. We mean that certain ways of treating you are wrong. Not only are they wrong, but they can also wrong you. In other words, you are a bearer of inherent value, right? And typically, if you look at these two normative concepts, the one of honor and the one of moral status, the other one, we honor you relative to the quality of your conduct, right, over time. The other one, we respect you merely because of being a particular kind of a thing. In other words, you possess particular metaphysical properties. And because you possess these particular metaphysical properties, then we owe you respect, right? So in the literature in the West, sometimes people talk about consciousness, some people talk about rationality, some people talk of utilitarians talk of sentiency, some scholars talk about being a subject of experiences. And yeah, Nussbaum talks of capabilities, basic capabilities. Nussbaum talks of basic capabilities. All of this, if you've got basic capabilities or if you've got rationality, depending on what theory you subscribe to, you have moral status. And that's a very interesting thing. So I want to bring your attention to two of these concepts, because for me they're interesting, right? Two of these concepts, right? Because for me they're interesting, just for reflection. Maybe let me say three for now. The first concept of a person. So the first concept of a person is as a person as a human being, right? Very interesting. So one of the most interesting things that you will see when you look into the literature, theorization that has happened about what constitutes a person metaphysically, you'll find it typically among the literature among the Ghanaian scholars and also among the Nigerian philosopher scholars, right, where they stipulate particular metaphysical properties as the basis of what constitutes personhood. But other than that, there's not been much literature that gives us particularly secular or naturalist interpretations of what constitutes human nature. If you look, for example, philosophy of mind, look at philosophy of mind. I know that some colleagues that are in this particular conversation wrote a book published in Springer Briefs that attempted a project like that, a contribution to philosophy of mind. Right. But for me, what I have found interesting is that we have entered in conversations about this idea of personhood, but typically what we have avoided is providing secular accounts of what constitutes human nature. One of the most underdeveloped aspects of African philosophy, particularly in metaphysics, and particularly of the continental approach, is this thing of philosophical anthropology. Philosophical anthropology. You won't find much particularly in contemporary African philosophy, scholars looking into the idea of personhood, trying to make a case for philosophical anthropology. And also that also is something that has to do with the geography of our knowledge. If you look into the divide, particularly in South Africa, and I'm sure also in other African countries, of how philosophy is taught, right? Universities that teach continental philosophy will put an emphasis on the will to talk. There will be a module on philosophical anthropology. But typically in analytic traditions, you won't have anything in that regard. And as a result, I think there's a serious issue in terms of having particularly for those people who've got a secularist leaning to give an account of philosophical anthropology that will start from how we understand human nature and account for it and defend that kind of a thing. You do find snippets of it, but it's far from being a robust engagement. That's one weakness that I generally find in discussions of personhood. It's a direction that I've also intentionally avoided because I'm not really interested in some of these metaphysical issues that sometimes excite many of our brilliant minds in the continent. But I want to talk on the second concept of a personhood, this idea of personal identity. I think it's an unfortunate development in philosophy, that African philosophy, that we have not invested time to think about personal identity. We have not invested time. From the top of my head, I can think of few scholars that have approximated this particular project, but even that approximation itself has not been very satisfactory. Right? So the idea of personal identity, it's same person, being a particular subject over time, with, that we can say in time 1, time 2, time 3, time 20, is still the same person over time. This is not negating that there will be changes in terms of body, in terms of the views that you hold, in terms of careers. There will be those changes. But at any time we encounter you, it's reasonable to think that we are dealing with the same person, right? Dealing with the same person. There's that idea of personal identity. I can tell you that, the initial approximation of this idea, you find it in John Mbiti, at least one that is in the written corpus. Find it in John Mbiti. When Mbiti talks about I am because we are. So in this particular case, the first concept of a person is presumed, it's taken for granted that he's referring to a human being. But now he's trying to give an account of how to explain how do we become the kinds of persons that we are. Trying to give an account of that. At the one hand, it's a psychological account. On the other hand, it's also a sociological account. The idea of socialization, how to become socialized, so that we are members of particular families, we speak particular languages, we belong to particular groups, and we then develop to function in particular spheres in our societies. That is one of the ideas that I find has not been properly engaged properly, this idea of personal identity. At most what we find, we find a debate. And it's a negative debate. It's a debate that says the best way to account for personhood is not to emphasize metaphysical properties, And that particular debate finds its expression in Ifeanyi Menkiti when he disputes what he calls the minimalistic conception of a person. So he says that it's minimalistic for you to reduce the idea of personal identity, what it means to be a person in this sense, by referring to a soul or referring to psychological properties, right? And the insight that comes out of that is that when you do that, you are forgetting something very powerful. You are forgetting the relationality of what it means to be a person. So the obvious contribution that African thinkers have been making when they think about personal identity, which is a metaphysical construct, is that relationships are important. But what has not been coming out clearly, it's what kinds of relationship do this kind of a job? What kinds of relationship does this kind of a job? That for me, I found that to be a very, very important question that I think would really benefit discourse in this regard. Scholars have tried to come with it, but when scholars try to deal with this question, um, the best that they would do, I mean, for example, Jeter in the 1937 piece says uh, the community discovers and nurtures these properties, right? It's the best he gives us. How do we account for social for this social identity in terms of the communities? And the community discovers these and develops them, right? That's all. That's all that you get in terms of the detail. Um, our brother, brilliant philosopher, um, Eze, also comes to the same thing. To say no. Individuality and communality, they complement each other in a complex process. But how that process itself happens is still not very clear. It's still not very clear. It's not very clear. So the question, so one of the areas that I think philosophers really need to invest themselves is to think about this question. I must say, the most promising account that I've seen to date on this idea of personal identity, I don't think it was intended to be an account of personal identity. It's in the recent book by Orisek Bupemi, Anthony Oyowe, in his book on Menkiti, right? And he thinks that personhood is a social kind, just like money is a social kind. He gives a very interesting account of how personal identity is a social kind, right? In a way that it depends on the institutions, the traditions, the rituals, the protocols, the language that forms society are the ones that are responsible for constituting us as social kinds. Right? Very interesting idea of personal identity. Very interesting idea of personal identity. That personal identity. So when you talk of personhood in that sense, you're talking about a social kind. He draws this idea from John Searle. John Searle's idea of social kind. That ontological intervention. That when we think of personhood, in actual fact, you're talking of a construction of social kinds. Right? When he talks about community constitutes personhood, the idea at play there is when you think of money as a social kind. Now that I found to be very interesting, that it is the institutions, it is the rules that informs the institution that make money, and from those rules, then you can meaningfully talk about money. So one interesting way, in this particular way, to think about personal identity is then to think about the the kind of institutions at play. And if you understand those kinds of institutions, and if you understand the kinds of rules, and you understand the kinds, then you could have an idea of personal identity. And that, for me, I find to be a very interesting idea. For me, I find that to be one of the most sophisticated accounts of this idea of personal identity. And this idea of personal identity for me is important. This idea of personal identity is important. I mean, um, uh, after the aftermath of colonialism, the damage that we see in our humanity as Africans, the way identities have informed, the borders, the xenophobia, the genocide that has happened, we encounter that. So one of the most important projects that we've really had to think about is the project of how we imagine a space for new humanity. And by new humanity here is that the fact that we're human being, at least in this particular context, in there are instances where it is not questioned. But the deeper question that we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of humanity do we want to sponsor? And in trying to understand what kind of humanity we're trying to sponsor, we must think about the institutions that we rely on in the creation of social identities. But until we have a correct conception of what we mean by personal identity in African metaphysical thinking, we're going to have a problem. How are we going to deal with issues of tribalism? How are we going to deal with issues of xenophobia? How are we going to deal with issues of Pan-Africanism? How are we going to talk about African unity when we have not carefully thought about this question of metaphysically making a contribution to thinking about issues of social identity? How are we going to deal with the phenomena of urbanization? How are we going to deal with phenomena of the nature of our politics, right? And how we're going to deal. So for me, this idea
Okay, I think we lost Professor Molefe there. Let's give him a few minutes to get back. Okay, Prof, I think you're back now. The floor is yours. You may continue.
Thank you. How little time do I have now?
I think you still have like 10 minutes left.
10 minutes. So,
Yeah.
so what I was trying to construct, some of these real issues that have to do with tribalism, tribal conflicts, family issues, issues of borders, issues of the unity of Africa, issues of the kind of humanity we want to construct amongst our young people and old people, all of those issues, we are far from addressing them as Africa if we as philosophers have not paid special attention to this second concept of personhood as personal identity, social identity. And I'm saying that one of the interesting theories that has come in that particular idea, this idea of Oyowe says, look, this is a social kind, right? And the idea of a social kind, it captures this idea of a community. And what I find very interesting about this idea um, by Oyowe, and I find it to be sociologically powerful for me, because I'm interested in this idea of sociological imagination. When he starts his book, he goes to a particular community that had no incidences of the common diseases that are common in the world. You know, no diabetes, these lifestyle diseases, no those kinds of diseases. And he says when they went to do research, says one of the explanation as to why this was the situation was that these people still lived in a community. The explanation was not found on individual attributes. The explanation that found was that this kind of society these people have built for themselves, the kind of social beings that they are, the way they rely on each other, the kind of social interaction that they've created. So even at that idea, still he points us that to explain even health issues, you need to understand how we understand society and the social processes. That's what I call sociological imagination. And I'm saying if you take the idea of social kind seriously as one way to think about personal identity, I think it can bring us closer to dealing with some of the perennial issues of Africa in terms of the kind of humanity we want to sponsor post-colonial societies, and also now in post-one state societies, and also in post-failed societies, so that we are able to develop robust human beings who are social kinds. So the most important question then the philosophers have to do: what kinds of social rules must prevail here? Right? Have our languages been doing the kinds of work that they must do in humanizing human beings? Right? So these, I think, are some of the most important questions that this second idea of identity as personal identity has been neglected by philosophers is going to take us forward. Maybe let me just make reflection on the other idea that I think is important. This idea of moral status. One of the most difficult questions that has confronted Africans, and that explains why we were subjected to all kinds of abuses, slavery, colonization, is this idea of being our humanity being questioned and often being denied, right? And this idea that people can deny other people's humanity was based on a particular idea of moral status. But what's interesting about this idea of moral status, and I want to bring idea of moral status slash human dignity, is that so human beings have dignity. If you take Kant, for example, seriously, human beings have got human dignity because they've got rationality. And in the West, their social processes, they were able to demonstrate that they've got rationality because in a particular treatment of history, they were able to develop great scientific discoveries. They were able to get powerful ammunition by their side, like gunpowders. They were able to do all of that. And when they looked at that, they said, this is evidence that our history provides evidence that we are superior human beings. And they came to Africa, they didn't see those kinds of things. And then that was for them a reason to say that we have no humanity because they use rationality as a standard, right? So one of the most difficult things that is happening in our discussions on philosophy around this idea of moral status and human being, is that we have also fallen into a trap of thinking that we can appeal to a property as a basis to explain why as human beings we are special. And the search for a property is going on, but no one is able to find a property that is able to secure every human being. So the challenge, and this for me is an interesting metaphysical idea, because the basis for why you have moral status is that you must possess a particular metaphysical property. Understand? So I understand this idea opens itself to the so-called is-odd gap, right? The naturalistic fallacy. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think we need to seriously think about whether it's a correct approach to assign value to human beings, at least human beings, by appeal to a particular metaphysical property, appeal to a particular metaphysical property. And the danger is that particularly if we don't have a particularly if we don't one philosophically we don't have one property that you can assign to all human beings and all human beings have it, and number two, politically, when you don't have a voice to sponsor a metaphysical property that can be taken seriously by the world. And finally, also, when we have not sponsored a theory of human dignity that captures what we think is important about us as human beings, all we have entered into a race of saying, instead of basic capabilities, instead of rationality, now we can talk of capacity for friendly, of capacity for sympathy. That is Molefe, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. Right? We've entered into a game of saying, if you've got this capacity, is that a correct way to deal with what makes human beings to avail? All of this at heart are metaphysical questions, because we are positing metaphysical properties as a basis to assign value. I thought I must share those reflections with you. I hope they were helpful, and I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Molefe, for that electrifying presentation. I really enjoyed it myself, and I hope others did as well. So, right now, the floor is open for questions and comments on that presentation. You may raise your hand. You may drop your comments or questions in the comment section, and I'll read them out to Professor Molefe. And you may also drop them on our channel on Slack platform. So, who's going to go first? Who's ready with a
It's not
question?
a it's not a crime not to have any question. Let's not put people under pressure.
I could be so explicit. All right. William, you may proceed, please.
I was trying to connect the a priori, a posteriori distinction, and how Prof wants to ground metaphysics to the realm of a priori. I thought that distinction was exclusively epistemological and not metaphysical, so that to suppose that metaphysics is or confines to the realm of a priori is to suppose or to make some ontological assumptions that will be hard to defend, especially from a Kantian perspective. But my main worry had to do with if metaphysics is primarily a priori, it looks like we will miss a lot if we are to apply that sort of metaphysics to the personhood of, I mean, the concept of personhood as it is understood in African philosophy. So in African philosophy, I understand personhood to be a lived thing, not some abstract or non-empirical thing that can only be grasped through abstract or pure rationality. That is what Kant assigns to the a priori. So to that extent, even if metaphysics was primarily a priori, we would have trouble connecting it, or it would lack the conceptual resources with which to deal with a traditional conception of personhood that is grounded in a culture, that is grounded in the collective experience of a people, and in a culture in which you don't come with a certain predetermined notion of personhood, but the community in which you find yourself confers on you certain properties that distinctly mark you as a person. So I wanted him to say more about that. And the second part of the question is to connect it a little bit to an African conception of personhood that fits so well with the conception of the concept of the virtual, because that is a distinction between AI and humanity. We live in the real world. AI is taking us into a virtual world. We want the conception of personhood that would help us deal with the notions of the virtual and the real, as is often used to distinguish between humans and what AI is doing.
All right, Prof.
Is this where I come in? Is it?
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, no, thank you. I suppose when I started, I started by saying, look, so you've got the zone of the a priori, and you've got the zone of the a posteriori, right? And the zone of the a posteriori is the zone of the contingencies, right? And typically in the style of, at least if my interpretation is true, the a priori typically is the zone of the necessary truths, right? Of the necessary, right? It's a zone of the necessary, and the a posteriori is a zone of the contingent. And I'm saying a metaphysical approach that looks down on the contingent, the a posteriori, which is the zone of the empirical, the mundane, the contingent, that takes the a priori as necessary and as prior, is very problematic. And then I start making a justification to say my lived experience as a boy from Soweto. I live in a particular world, framed by particular powerful institutions. When I was young, I was not aware of them. It's not even aware that I'm black. It's not even aware that I'm poor. Already there were the markets were there that could define that I'm poor. There was a racial system that could define that I'm black. And that had got implications for how my career is going to proceed. That had implications for my situations of my parents and situations of many other people in Africa. And also at the global scale, that had implications for other black people and also our politics in the world. And for me, that finds itself in the zone of the posterior of the contingency. But when we get into a classroom of philosophy, we are subjected to a metaphysical approach that does not take those things into consideration. So my suggestion approach to personhood this particular day is to say, let's take personhood to the posteriori, to the zone of the contingency. And then when we take it in that sense, so we need an interpretation of personhood, specifically focusing on personal identity, that also wants to interpret it as a social kind. And when you think of it as a social kind, it's a construction, right? That you can explain by appeal to institutions, that you can explain by appeal to particular rules. All of these are constructions, and these are construction of a community. And the minute you take it there, what it does, which I think is very powerful, we don't find ourselves running back to pristine Africa. We look for a community that also exists. We find ourselves standing in a mountain and asking ourselves a question: how do we activate our agency so that we take care of creating a world of social kinds where we are responsible for the kinds of social kinds we're trying to create? That is where I was. That was my submission. I don't know if that really helps.
All right, thank you, Prof. Any more questions?
And even this is the virtual reality we're talking about. It's a virtual reality that is instrumental. It's coming to serve the social kind. Because now there are other ways of experiencing what it means to be a social kind by also incorporating and also embracing the digital and also the virtual reality. So that's an extension and a function of the social kind.
All right, thank you, Prof. Next question, please, if we have any. Are there any more questions?
If there's none, I wanted to do a follow-up. That's why I raised a finger.
All right,
I have a
proceed.
question.
Okay, please. If there's a substantive question, I will yield.
Is that Francis?
No, this is Chibuzo.
Oh, Chibuzo. Okay, please proceed.
I want to thank you, Prof, for this wonderful notes. You said you want to situate personhood to a posteriori. I think this will become a metaphysical, should I use the word bias in metaphysics? Because situating personhood to a posteriori is looking at person from a one-way phenomenon, trying to look at person from a purely materialistic conception, which would be a negation of who a person really is. Because some school of thought will hold that the person is made up of the spiritual and the physical element, while some will go as far as including the soul as a part of a person. So if you're relating the person to just the community as an a posteriori material being, what therefore happens to the spiritual aspects that is a crucial part of a person? I think that should be my question.
Thank you for that. Well, look, I think I'm much closer to Redu than Jeje, because I mean the argument made by Redu is that even the soul, even the things that we think are spiritual, like the soul, if you go to a medicine man, they've got calls them quasi spiritual, because ultimately we can be able to give a material account of those things. For me, I think the pressing burden is that the pressing burden for me is this. Well, I mean, yes, I mean there are people who seem to take interest in this, in the supernatural, things like the soul and so on. But for me, the pressing question when I think about this idea of posteriori is that many of the changes that you see in the world, whether you want to explain virtual change, whether you want to talk about nuclear weapons that we don't have in Africa, whether you want to talk about nuclear medicine, whether you want to talk about the advances in medicine, you don't need you don't need to talk about these other things that seem to be important, right? And I'm saying that we already had an insight in this 1980 book, and in fact in that 1995 paper when talking about development in Africa, that what supernaturalism, he thinks of it as anachronistic in the 1980 book. What supernaturalism has done, and this is not to deny that people actually believe those things, but what supernaturalism has done, it's very consistent with this intuitive approach to life, and where we can go to people who appeal to that kind of those intuitions or those spiritual beliefs. But so we already say, but the mechanic in Ghana still wants to fix this thing and wants to use the human eye when it's got access to scientific tools to go beyond intuition and use measurable scientific tools to fix this thing. Right. So we want to have functional hospitals in Africa, and we don't need merely intuition. We want to build properly social institutions, social beings that develop in social institutions that have got proper protocols for changing the sphere in Africa. We want proper weapons in Africa. I don't know what those metaphysical beliefs will help with in this particular time. Right? I know that we've got a lot of these churches throughout the continent, and I'm very happy for that. But I'm saying the view that I'm pushing, which is both political and philosophical, is that let's transcend supernaturalism. Let's transcend the kind of intuition that leans on this kind of naturalism and start embracing a kind of an a posteriori society that is going to take science seriously. The science that explains why there are pyramids in Sudan and in Egypt. That kind of science. And then see if we take a metaphysics that takes that particular orientation, what kind of Africa we can build. So that is where I'm at. What kind of agency are we trying to influence if we take that particular view? And I think this idea of sociological imagination married to this idea of social kinds, and then we take responsibility for the kinds of social institutions that we're going to create. So I want to operate in the zone of the contingent. The suffering men and women in Africa are in that zone. They are not in some metaphysical thing. They're in that zone. And I'm saying I want a philosophy and a metaphysics that speaks to that.
All right, thank you, Prof. Any more question?
I was interested in that comeback with a
Okay,
finger.
okay, yeah. Okay. Before the comeback, I think we have a question for. Oh, okay. It's still the same person, right? William. I think then you may come on with your comeback.
Okay, a follow-up was that following Kripke, Saul Kripke, we now know that the a priori is not the exclusive zone of the contingent, and a priori is not the exclusive zone of necessity. We know there are now things like necessary a posteriori facts and truth. We also have contingent a priori facts and truth. So I was wondering how, if we are sensitive to this fact, whether taking personhood or confining it to the contingent a priori zone actually plucks it off entirely from the realm of necessity, as you want to put it. But a greater risk is that there seems to be something about person that societies and communities build on or based on to confer or deny personhood. So let's say two entities are given birth at the same time in a particular community. And after a few weeks or a few months or after a few years, if you like, whatever time or duration it takes to confer on someone personhood or what to acquire whatever properties is worth considering for the candidacy of personhood. Now, it appears that there must be something prior, something about that entity which marks it off as automatically qualified to be considered for personhood as against another. So there's a reason why no matter what, a dog will never be considered for personhood in an African community. Why? Because there is something distinctive about that entity we call human, which automatically marks him off as candidate for personhood. So much so that even if for some medical or pathological reasons he's reduced to a vegetable, he's still a better candidate than even the most intelligent animal. So it appears to me then that there is this solid marriage between the contingent and the necessary. There is some necessary facts about that entity to which we or on which we confer personhood. So much so that all other beings which we don't consider for personhood lack that. So it will be problematic to completely ground personhood in the realm of the a priori contingent as you want to suggest.
Thanks for the follow-up, Prof.
Thank you. I look. I'm not. Look, I think I'm not sure if the problem is my view or the problem is the assumptions that you are coming with. I agree. We see two human beings here. We seem to think that there's something special about them, morally speaking. But when we enter into a particular zone, we've entered into the zone of values. We've entered into the zone of values. And those values could as well be cultural. I mean, there are some societies, if you put a black person here and put a dog here, some people will go for the dog. So that's why I'm saying that we've entered. I think the minute we use those intuition as an entering a zone, and one of the things that shocks me, I used to stay in East London and I used to walk by the beach in the mornings. I could tell you that there are dogs in the world that live better lives than an average black person. And most of the people that walk with their dogs, typically white, the worker in their house does not have a medical aid. The dog has a medical aid. If you follow that intuition through, it shows you where they place more value. So for some people, if you put a dog and put another human being, a baby here, and the baby happens to be black, and you put a dog, they will choose a dog. So that's why I'm saying Maybe there we're not dealing with my argument. We're dealing with assumptions about where to put value. And if we do that in a world that we live in, that experiment will not yield the same results across board, right? But when I'm suggesting that maybe let's move into the posterior eye. But there's something interesting that you're saying. It reminds me of a paper in the 1992 book, the Ghanaian book by Jeche and Wiredu, where Jeche talks about personal identity. So now Wiredu is operating in the posterior eye space. Now he wants to essentialize African identity. There are things that are distinctive about Africa. And then he invokes the idea of necessity. But it's not a very strong idea of identity and the idea of necessity, because he wants to say there are things that necessarily, there are posteriori that in a sense can be necessary. Because if you want to be able to identify Africans, there are certain things you can say, hey, these are typical of them. So he does talk about something similar to that idea that we have. But it doesn't quite get him far, because the idea of what it means to an African today and what it means to an African 30 years is going to change. So you have this idea of so the idea of flexibility and evolution just escapes us. Then it always escapes us. And that is why for now I'm saying I'll think seriously about this synthetic relationship. I know ultimately that's where Kant goes, and that's where scholars, like rightly mentioning Kripke, they want to think about the intersection of these two. But when I'm suggesting that, when we do that, because we've been operating in this a priori zone of necessity as the zone of the truly metaphysical, I'm saying maybe our journey should start from the posterior eye. And then we can marry the posterior eye heuristically to maybe necessity, right? Even then, it's heuristic, because we might discover other truths, and there are always changes that are happening to human beings. And then I'm saying what that is going to do for philosophy, which I think it has not been able to do, is that you sit in a class, and I'm an expert in ethics. You sit in a class, you go through normative ethics, you discuss utilitarianism, you discuss feminism, you discuss all these theories, you discuss egoism. You discuss these theories as if these are concepts that are hanging in the vacuum. They've got no social basis. You can't explain them on the basis of social basis, right? So, and what we are escaping is the a posteriori. We treat these as if they are a priori concepts. You see what I mean? We leave the posteriori. We leave the contingencies of history within which they emerge. And I'm saying if African philosophy and metaphysics is to be meaningful, it must locate itself within the contingent space of reality, where reality happens. And I'm saying that is a proper intervention in curriculum, the proper intervention in terms of imagining the kind of humanity we want for Africa. And it invites our agency to be involved in forming the social kinds of beings that we want.
All right, thank you, Prof. I think this should be the last one for today. Arabia, please.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much, Prof. Molefe, for your talk. I'll just piggyback on some of the stuff you just said. So people like Jonathan Chimakonan think that personhood is something that is communally determined. So it doesn't matter what the individual says of himself or thinks of himself or his or her personhood. It is the community that defines the individual. If we take that to be true and we push this narrative to the global arena, you would most likely agree with me that most people who are considered Black thought of as not having personhood. And if we take Jonathan's view to its logical conclusion, it doesn't matter what African philosophers or Black philosophers themselves, for instance, say about their personhood or their views about personhood. All those sorts of ideas are just mere wishful thinking in the global space, because the community of people outside of the Black community do not view Black people as persons. So my question is, what then is the use for discussions of personhood in, say, African philosophy, when all this talk, if Jonathan is correct, means nothing, since the global community does not think of Africans as persons? Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting question. I think, yeah. So for me, so maybe three things quickly. One, it depends what Jonathan means by personhood is determined by the community. Depends what he means by that. If he means what I mean by it drawing from Oyowe that it's social kinds, then I think I agree with him. And I think if you follow me to my logical conclusion, social kinds are constructions. And that construction, it's our work as agents. We construct that kind. So we build the institutions. We are responsible for the language. We inherit this language. We still have to develop it further. We still have to weaponize it to particular directions in ways that we've not been doing. We want to weaponize it towards science. We want to weaponize it towards philosophy. So there is that element of agency that comes out that is very strong. So I'm imagining, so if that's what you mean. Number two, maybe so that you appreciate this, that insight by Wiredu in his 2009 paper, is let's not hypostatize the idea of community as if a community is a thing there that you can point to. So think of community as an arrangement, social arrangement of culture where there's language, there's rituals, there's traditions, right? And this requires active agents within that. Think of a community as that. Don't think of it as a thing. So when we say community, when we say in literature, we say community determines. We're not imagining some object doing things, influencing people, a master puppeteer. No. We're thinking of social why are we not? I mean, one of the difficult questions that Africa is running away from. We saw the Euro-American communities bomb Libya. We saw what's happening in Congo. We've got no power as Africans. Is because we have not built institutions. We have not built institutions. We have not built those institutions, and we are still not building those institutions that are going to make sure that as we are the kinds of social kinds that are going to have institutions where we are going to be self-determining in the way that we can be, where we can. Now Africa should be having a conversation about when are we going to have nuclear weapons as a continent so that we can protect ourselves, right? When other people are self-licensing themselves. So I think what's important about the kind of idea that I'm propagating here, and by personhood, I mean personal identity, is the idea that calls forth agency in building institutions for the kinds of social beings that we want to be, in the way that the market is able to determine the value of money. So we can build institutions that can build the kinds of human beings that we want to be. And for me, practically, I work for a business school. I'm saying myself, I've got a responsibility to build particular kinds of leaders and managers. And I'm saying, how do I look into my curriculum and start thinking about how do I weaponize this curriculum to be able to train the kinds of leaders that will think about issues of inter-Africa trade, that will think about leaders that I'm sending back to the private and public sector. So for me, the idea of social kinds that I have in mind, and what I mean when I say community determines, I'm imagining social kinds that are responsible for the social institutions that are governing our lives and how we will weaponize them in terms of policy and laws to be able to be self-determining. I mean just that. And I think with the right kind of politics, we can be able to the way the Chinese have done for themselves, the way Singapore is doing for itself, we can be able to build the kind of social institutions and social beings that will have prided themselves, that will be able to build a kind of society that they want to live in and have a better Africa.
Interesting. I wish this can go on for a very long time. I think let me just try and accommodate Professor Chimakonam here. Prof.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm sorry to have to cut him here, but I was compelled to because Arabia misrepresented me a little. Yeah. Largely, I agree with Molefe. I think our ideas are quite similar. I conceive identity as socially constructed, but I do not conceive the society as one absolute universal entity in which those who dominate that circle determine the structure of identity of other peoples. No, that is not my idea of society. My idea of society is one that is multiple, all right, existing in different geographies, in local communities. In essence, your immediate local community or society is actually one that determines your personhood, because it is within that society that the appurtenances of your identity is formed and forged. And so Arabia, yes, But I wasn't talking about one global society, like one big mammoth entity that can license itself to determine the structure of identities of other people. No, your immediate society is what determines your identity, so to speak. It doesn't matter what you think of yourself. What they think of you is the identity you exude, you carry with yourself. Whatever you think of yourself that rivals what they think of you is most likely material within that society. Thank you very much, Ben, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Molefe, for this very wonderful lecture that you have given to us. I was busy making my notes. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. We should have more of these. Thanks, colleagues. I really enjoyed myself.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Molefe. That was really, really wonderful. And that's our final lecture for today. For those who are interested in continuing the conversation, you can join our Slack channel. It's open. You can continue the conversation there as long as possible. There is no end. And also network and try to meet with other scholars and probably collaborate on publishing research papers in this area or other areas. Tomorrow we'll be having a contemporary African metaphysical views delivered by Professor Chimakunam on Mekoka and African metaphysics and Dr. Atto on consolationism and predeterministic historicity. I'm not sure you want to miss that. It promises to be more interesting than it is today. In the meantime, I think this is where I yield the mic to Dr. Ayo to give us a vote of thanks and then we can call it a day. Dr. Ayo, are you around?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Ben, for the wonderful job. Well done. For distinguished lecturers, organizers, and participants, permit me to, at this point, to thank you for your patience and your time. As we draw this summer school on Introduction to Traditional African Metaphysics to a close, I'm honored to offer a brief word of thanks. So on behalf of the organizing committee, the convener, and everyone, we express our deep gratitude to our lecturers whose rigorous scholarship and engaging presentation have illuminated the rich metaphysical tradition of Africa, the tradition that has been often marginalized, yet profoundly relevant. To the organizing committee, we thank you for your seamless coordination and commitment to academic excellence. To all participants, your thoughtful contribution and critical engagements have made this truly a collaborative learning space. The conversation we have shared here reaffirmed the enduring value of African thought in contemporary philosophical discourse. So as we depart today, I want us to carry forward the insights we've gained in today's lectures, not just as an academic content, but as a tool for rethinking reality, reconceptualizing personhood, and rethinking our communal existence in a diverse context in and beyond Africa. Thank you all for joining today's school summer school, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Please turn up tomorrow. See you. Bye-bye.